What's going on, guys? Nick here, recording live from my Airbnb in Vancouver. In this video, I'm going to be talking about 4 huge mistakes to avoid when delegating in your AI automation agency. These are mistakes that I see people making all the time, and this is, these are mistakes that are so big that they might as well just kill your freaking business. But in this video, I'm going to show you how to avoid that. As per usual, just so you know, this is just my process. It's not the only way to get there or to delegate. It's just what got me to $72K a month with mine. So take whatever makes sense to you out of this video that you find valuable and discard what isn't relevant. Last but not least, no gatekeeping. I'm just going to show you everything plus give you the sauce. Every time that I've done that on YouTube before, I've just been rewarded disproportionately. So I'm going to keep on going. So the 4 delegation problems that I want to talk about today are as follows. And this generally happens when you start delegating systems to your first few staff members. Note that when I say delegating systems to your first few staff members, I don't mean like delegating to salespeople. I don't mean delegating to accountants or admin staff. I mean specifically delegating systems to be built by primarily engineers. So you can imagine that this happens pretty often in companies like this. This is a very simple agency pipeline as well, whether you're doing graphic design, creative design, anything like that. Or PPC campaigns, right? I'm just listing off agency service models at this point, but I think you get my point. Essentially, you get your business to a certain status with revenue, $25,000 a month, $30,000 a month or more. And you find that there's no longer any way that you can fulfill the work yourself. So naturally, what you look to do is you look to hire like a second in command. You look to hire some type of, whether you want to call them an assistant, whether you want to call them an engineer, whatever, that's basically what they are. And this is like a very simple and common roadmap for automation agency owners as well, simply because it's usually one of the first businesses that they've ever started. I talk about why employing the whole like hiring a second in command approach is bad in one of the previous videos. So I'm just going to leave that there. And if you guys want to check that out, feel free to. But generally, this leads to a number of very major problems. And they're problems that you aren't really expecting, and they're problems I'm going to go over right now. The first is what I like to call the coordination problem. So when you have one person in your business, or when you work on that business yourself, time to complete a project is just equal to the amount of time that it takes for you to build said project. So physically, the time that it takes for you to sit down on your keyboard and your mouse and to drag and drop modules and to get something done. But when you have 2 people, the time to complete a project is now not just the time to complete the project, but it's the time to complete each portion, plus the time spent communicating and coordinating about each portion, plus the time spent waiting in between the communication and in between the coordination periods. And those last 2 bits there are extremely important, and they can take way more time than the actual entire project. And it's something that, if you're just a solopreneur or you're a freelancer, or you're coming from that sort of background and you start building, you don't really realize until you start, essentially having to do project management more than the actual work. This scales with a number of people. So I have an analogy here when I solve this problem for you in a moment. But if you hire 2 people to do something, you're not doing it twice as fast. You're essentially doing it about half as fast. If you hire 3 people to do something, you're not doing it 3 times as fast. You're doing it about a third as fast. I found the quality of the end result can certainly go up. But if you're building a productized automation agency, or really any type of productized business model, the quality doesn't really matter because it's usually just the same every time, right? Now, this is a major business killer. This is probably the #1 business killer, which is why I put it here. And again, if you're unfamiliar with any sort of project management, this is going to crush you. So I'm going to show you how to solve this problem in a moment, and it's a lot easier than most people think, but keep that one in mind. The second major issue is what I like to call the motivation problem. And that's essentially where you notice a major difference between your motivation and theirs. This isn't usually a big problem when things are going well in the business, but when things aren't going well in the business, it tends to be. Essentially, you can derive this problem from the fact that it is your business, whereas for them, they just happen to be in it. You bear responsibility for the ups and the downs of the company. They don't. I mean, sure, the bounded downside there, the worst thing that can happen is you let them go. But if you think about the worst thing that could happen for you, your business could go bankrupt. You could be financially devastated. You could be insolvent. I mean, depending on obviously how you structure assets and whatnot. But obviously there's a big difference in the risk. There's a big difference in the incentive structure. So I'm going to show you how I personally like to solve this problem in a few moments. The third issue when delegating, specifically to engineers, is they often don't have full context surrounding the project. And this is what I call the context problem. You can kind of sum it up as follows. Basically, you, most likely you, or if your company's a little bit bigger, your sales team sold the deal. In order to sell the deal, they needed to get on a call with a prospect. They needed to walk them through what their problem was that they were suffering from. They need to press on those pain points, and then they need to close the deal. And so essentially what happens is, because they closed the deal and then they passed it off to the engineers, essentially what ends up happening is there's like this game of telephone between the sales team and then your back end, where what the sales team understood was a little bit different from what the engineers understood. And even if that difference is like only a little bit, just 10%, well, the client is going to be judging you on what they told the salesperson. Whereas, the result that you're going to be giving them is what your engineers did. So that game of telephone is extraordinarily important. And this leads to a ton of issue. Not necessarily, I wrote here completing task. It can certainly lead to an issue completing the task. But moreover, it just leads to how it is perceived by the client as substantially less valuable usually. The last thing is what I like to refer to as the engineer myopia problem. And that's basically just like if you were to hire engineers or people on the back end, these people tend to be a lot more detail-oriented, right? And because they are more detail-oriented, they usually sort of lose the forest for the trees. They don't really understand the reason why these systems are being built for the business. Like a very simple question to ask is, hey, why is this automation valuable to my client? It's a question that basically no engineer will ask themselves out of the box. And I'll show you how to solve this problem by guiding them through a couple of quick questions. I'll show you a little form that I set up to do this in my own business. And I know this doesn't sound like that big of a deal. Engineers, let them be engineers is what I'm hiring them for. But business value is literally all your current clients will care about. That's why they hired your salespeople in the first place, right? So if your engineers, the people that are building these systems, they don't understand the real business utility here, the systems that they do build are going to be almost necessarily shitty. Or if they're not just shitty, they're just not going to be as good as they could be, for sure. So these are the 4 big delegation problems. They've been major issues in my own business. If I'd solved them earlier, I'd probably be much better off than I am right now. And I've solved all of these in due time. Some of them have taken me a few weeks. Some of them have taken me a few months. I've tried dozens of different approaches. But what I'm just going to do now is I'm going to run you through how I personally solve this. And this is going to be really valuable to you if you're at this stage in your agency where you're just about to hire somebody, or you've already hired somebody and you're wondering, what the hell's going on? Why can't I grow? Why is my agency a revolving door, or that sort of thing? So the first problem I want to talk about is the coordination problem. It goes kind of like this. If you hire people to dig a well, then 2 people will do the job twice as fast as 1 person. 2 shovels, 2 people, 2 outputs, right? 1 person does it at speed X, 2 people will do it at speed 2X approximately. But in knowledge work, let's say building systems, or the example I have here, writing articles, writing a paper, that does not work and it does not scale. If you hire 2 people to write a paper, your end result is not the fact that you get a paper in half the time. You're probably going to end up getting that paper in twice as long, essentially, because of a few reasons. The first is that time spent communicating is necessarily time not spent working on said problem. So I don't want to call it wasted time, because obviously there's value to the business, but they're not working on the problem. They're working around or about the problem. The other big issue is most of us these days use messaging platforms. Most of us these days use Slack. These are remote businesses that we're operating, right? It's one of the main reasons why you'd want to operate, a digital agency, because it's remote. But when you use messaging platforms like this, there's always going to be a lag between when your message is sent and then when it's received. And moreover, like when it's read by the person and understood by the person. So for instance, I might send a message to Sally at 4 p.m. I'll say, hey, Sally, thanks so much for working on this. I just had a quick question about XYZ. Do you mind helping me out with that? Sally maybe she's busy working at her desk. She's going to get this at, 5:15 or something. But maybe her shift ends at 5 o'clock. So I'm not actually going to get a response until maybe the next day at like 9 a.m. or something. And then it's going to take me a little while to digest what she said. And then I might send another message back. But if you think about the time between 4 p.m. and then 9 a.m. the next day, that's 16 hours? And so we've essentially added 16 hours to a loop that doesn't need to be 16 hours. Not only that, when you add in other time zones, shift starts, ends, unfortunate holidays, stuff like that, miscommunications, even minor miscommunications, weekends, you can literally add like weeks to a project that is just completely unnecessary. You do not need. And then another issue that I didn't mention here that just came to me is essentially that when you do this, a person has to sort of remember what the problem is about. If you send Sally a message at 5 p.m. one day and then she doesn't see it until 9 a.m. the next day, at 4 p.m. and she doesn't see it till 9 a.m. the next day, well, Sally now needs to just run through, oh yeah, what the hell was that problem about? And so there's some sunk time that she needs to spend literally like rebuilding this problem in her head. And because it's knowledge work, that isn't always perfect. It's not always right. It doesn't always happen very easily. And that leads to a number of other issues. So how do you actually solve the coordination problem? Well, the biggest and probably number one way that I've solved this in the past is I just make it a rule not to split up my projects. I will basically always hire one person to do an automation project from end to end, which eliminates all communication costs entirely. It'll also solve the context problem, which I touched on at the beginning, and I'll do a lot more in detail in a moment. But essentially, by having one person do everything, even if the tasks aren't necessarily all in the exact same flavor or type of task, we avoid that massive message window. We avoid the bullshit. We avoid basically that big time lag. And then the person, just gets to do the task very quickly. Another way that I've solved this is I just written documentation on how to do everything in the business before I start hiring. What I mean by that is I have SOPs for basically every task that I or anybody else has ever done. And we have a rule in the business where if we have to do something more than twice, then it needs to be written about, essentially. Obviously, it's more of a cultural thing. The simplest way to do this would just be to start writing documentation on all the SOPs in the business, all the major tasks, all the major systems. In order for this to work, you do need to standardize your offering, which is good to do anyways, obviously, if you want to productize. But really the benefit here is by reading a piece of documentation, nobody needs to wait to send or receive a message. There's also no communicating time. There might be reading time, researching time, but that's sort of like one directional. It's not bidirectional. It's not like something you have to wait for. And it solves a ton of issues just having documentation on stuff. Obviously, you also need to make sure the person that you're hiring is capable of reading said documentation. You need to make sure to instill that in the hiring process and that sort of thing. That like, hey, if you don't get something, we have documentation for literally everything. You need to make sure the person is self-sufficient. But these are the two simple ways that I, in the past, have solved the coordination problem. And doing the first one, especially this one here, this has completely changed my business, because before I'd always try and squeeze out as much margin as I could by delegating task A, which is really simple, to maybe virtual assistants in lower cost of living countries where I don't have to pay them as much. But the issue with that is now we have substantially longer turnaround times because, one, the time zone issue that I mentioned earlier, and then two, the time to coordinate and message about the problem. And then what I end up finding is, the clients are so much less likely to pay me money if my project takes 3 weeks to deliver as opposed to 1 week. They're so less likely to want to work with me on follow-up projects that essentially just like eliminates the margin increase that I was able to achieve anyway. So just sort of pointless. So I think that what I just did here looks way cooler. So we're just going to do that from now on. Okay, so how to solve the motivation problem, right? The first problem was the context problem. Sorry, the coordination problem. This one is the motivation problem. The motivation problem basically looks like this. Your business is your business. So if it fails, your business completely disappears. To you, that's financially devastating. Whereas to your staff member, they're merely out of a job. Why? Well, if it's your business, you are 100% owner, you will bear the vast majority of the risk. You will also bear the vast majority of the downside. In addition to that, not only do you bear the vast majority of the downside, you also get the vast majority of the gains, and you also get the vast majority of the upside. So when things go really crappy, right, you suffer. When things go really amazingly, then you benefit. And this wild roller coaster ride of business is not the same for your staff member. Your engineer will either be paid hourly or they'll be paid project-wise, or at least the vast majority of us will hire them at least initially because it mitigates risk on our end. But this leads to a different type of risk, which is that you now have very different incentives. Like the incentives of your staff member are 100% different than yours, because when you win, they don't necessarily win. When you lose, they don't necessarily lose. When you need to really get a project done, time crunch wise, 5:30 p.m., but maybe their shift ends at 5. I personally don't even like doing the time things, but I'm just trying to make this as applicable as possible, like a daily schedule. Are they going to be willing to take that call and then go back to their laptop and then maybe finish out a few extra changes in the system they need to make? Probably not, right? And, there are cultural reasons for that, obviously, but there are also valid reasons, which is just that they're not incentivized to do it. They don't really get anything extra. So what can I do to fix it? Well, the first is just incentivize them. Pay based on performance instead of just time. Pay a percentage of the project amount that you closed. Pay a percent bonus at the end of the month or end of the year based off certain milestones. Pay them a multiplier based on delivery time, right? If your delivery time is 1 week, they finish the project in 6 days, give them a 1/7 bonus for the project, right? 1 extra day remaining in the project time. Pay them, give them equity in your business if they're one of your founding engineers, right? Do whatever you can to make it so that when they go on that upside, then they rejoice. And then when they go on that downside and they really suck and they suffer, then they're not having a good time. Note that not everybody is going to want this. The people that do want this are going to be substantially more internally motivated, and they're going to end up being much better staff for you. So those are the people that you work with, essentially the people that are willing to be intrinsically motivated. Essentially, the term is an internal locus of control, because they will be willing to suffer alongside you and then rejoice alongside you as well. Essentially much more responsible of a group of people. So that's a motivation problem. The next big issue is the context problem. I've touched on this earlier, but the context problem is a really big one. And it's also a silent killer in a lot of businesses that people don't realize is going on. I think if I were to take this problem and show it to a lot of big software development agencies, big software consultancies, people that are making $10 to $100 million a year, they'd be very unlikely to fully understand this. So here's the issue. Most companies will play telephone. Most companies will split themselves up into a front end and a back end. The front end is responsible for selling the thing. The back end is responsible for fulfilling the thing. There's some interdepartmental communication between the two, but as your company grows, that gets more difficult, things get more strenuous. And let me just put it this way, there's a reason why basically every sales department hates the engineering or fulfillment department, and every engineering or fulfillment department hates the sales department. Because the salespeople will promise one thing, and then the engineers will be having to be responsible to fulfill it. And then when the salespeople promise the thing and the engineers can't fulfill it, they end up just hating each other, essentially. The problem is that what is lost in translation is never recovered. A client will say one thing to a salesperson, then the salesperson will pass it through their own filters, biases, knowledge, lack of knowledge, and incentives, and then tell that to the engineers, right? So the engineers are basically working off of information that is completely opposed or different, right? People that sell have different incentives than people that build. They also have a different knowledge base. They understand things differently. They're often unable to communicate the exact client need or understanding to the back end. That just means that the back end team, when they get the project, they think the project is something different than it actually is. Doesn't this sound like so goddamn simple? But it's a major problem at most agencies. Basically, if you work with the wrong source material, even if it's 90% of the way there, it doesn't matter how good you are, the results are going to suck. The client is always going to be judging you on what the project that the sales team sold them is, not what the project the engineering team thinks is. So how do you fix this? The simplest way to do so, that I have done for myself, is we just record the sales call with the prospect. And then it's required viewing for the engineers before they build the system. So you can imagine how if you sell a system, you get the money and you shake hands on it, you then just send that sales call recording to the engineer alongside with the project scope, project request, project brief, whatever the hell you guys filled out together, right? Whatever your internal system is. So now your engineers actually see things from the source material. They're not hearing things from the game of telephone. And I know you're thinking, well, shit, man, that sales call's an hour. That hour is going to save you dozens of hours, both in client dissatisfaction and then in multiples on your engineer's time when you get that retainer, you get that next deal, that sort of stuff. The second thing you can do to fix it is to make sure your proposal scopes are very clear. Make sure that you only talk in terms of deliverables in your proposal or in your sales process. And then what you send to your engineers, like what the thing that they work off of, is not some internal reformulated scope or whatever. You actually just send them the exact same thing that you sent to the client in order to sell them, right? It's basically like, hey, the client saw the same thing that the engineers are saying. So the engineers know exactly what they're working on is the primary material. It's the same thing the client is judging them for. It's not some distilled version. It's not some internal brief thing, right? Like so many agencies have very lengthy, drawn out internal processes that are completely pointless. The third thing is systems are very visual. So when you're communicating between engineers, as you will sometimes have to do, Do it with video. I love using Loom personally because Loom's just the simplest way. I click one button and then a little window appears on my screen, and then in 3 seconds I'm talking about the system, people see it. And then that said, videos do also have a downside, which is that videos can be unclear, especially because human beings are unclear when they talk. So to solve that problem, use a bunch of text actionables at the end of every video that just outline exactly what party A is requesting, or maybe what party B wants, or something like that, right? Some deliverable, some asset, some resource, whatever. What I mean by that is combine the best of the both worlds, right? Text is extremely clear, but it often lacks, an understanding of the broader picture because it's a very low bandwidth format. Video is extraordinarily high bandwidth, but because of all that bandwidth, some information could be lost, and because it's linear and time-based and people forget things, sometimes they don't always ask for everything they want to do. So solve that problem by having a video where you discuss what you want to discuss. Then down at the bottom, just have, here are the actionables, X, Y, Z. And just have a culture and an SOP in your business where whatever is written under the actionable section is whatever the other person does. These are how I solved the context problem, and they made a major difference in my own business. I think they can probably make a major difference to yours. All right, so the last problem is called the engineer myopia problem. Now, if you're unfamiliar, myopia just means nearsightedness. Essentially means an inability to see very far. And I call this the engineer myopia problem because what you'll find is that when you work with engineers, when you work with really detail-oriented people, they're detail-oriented. So they're used to looking really close like this. But that necessarily means that the stuff behind them is kind of blurry. They can't really make it out fully. So when a client hires you to solve a business problem, they're hiring you because they obviously care about you solving the business problem, right? It's kind of trivial. But when you delegate a task to an engineer, the task now becomes removed from said business problem because the engineer is now focused on the particulars of the scope and particulars of the task as opposed to what the client wants the system to solve. They care less about the benefits, they care more about the features. The reason why is incentives. You or your sales team's job was to sell the system. The engineer's job is to complete the system. So sort of like evolutionarily, you're both going to arrive at different solutions to both those problems. The other thing is that engineers are engineers, so they don't often have practical business experience, meaning they struggle with understanding like practical business use cases. They don't understand the various industries that they are working with. They don't understand the problems that they're suffering from. They rarely have had to reformulate the features into benefits to sell because they don't sell. And again, you're hiring them because they're detail-oriented, right? So they're focused on details. And a lot of the time, people can't be great at everything. They might be better at being detail-oriented than they are at being big-picture thinkers. And, it's part of the value that they have in the business. But it's a problem when they're tasked to fulfill systems that solve client problems. Because they don't understand the client problem fully, well, then they're not going to be able to solve said client problem. So how do you fix it? Well, the first is the same thing I talked about before. Record the sales call with the prospect, make it required viewing before they build the system, because now you're anchoring the problem in the context of exactly what the client wants, the words that came out of the client's mouth. We're not making enough money. I want more X, Y, Z. I want more leads. I think our margins are really crap, whatever. And then the second thing, and the thing that really made a difference, was as part of your delegation process, have your engineer answer 3 questions. And I have a form for this I'll show you in a second. The first is literally like alongside you delivering this project, ask the engineer, what is the problem the client is suffering from after they watch a video? What value does this system have in solving that problem? What are we building? What we are building will solve their problem. So how is it going to solve it? Why is it going to solve it? And then assuming the system does solve that problem, what else do you think we can explore to help them? And this is our, put on our thinking cap and just pretend that we're not the engineer here. We're actually like the salesperson, we're the consultant. We're attempting to move their business forward, not necessarily just finish this one system. This is the bigger picture thinking. The way that I personally do this is with a type form. I'll just attach a type form to the project. It's reasonably straightforward, I think. Essentially what you do is in whatever your project manager is, you just have a form. That form is linked to the specific project. I do so by using a ClickUp ID. And so this is type form over here. If I go to logic and then I go to personalize with data and then variables, hidden fields is what I meant. You'll see there's a ClickUp ID field. And so I have the URL of my form. It's, www.typeform.com//ClickUp ID equals whatever the record is. And then I have a couple questions. And the questions are same questions that I asked. And you can make it so that the project manager or the sales team or something can just read through this before the engineer starts and just make sure that they are accurately understanding the problem and that they can reformulate it and phrase it in their own words. And That's the wrong screen. And not only will this make them a better engineer on this particular problem, it'll accumulate and make them better engineers on all future problems that they work on. Because even just doing this exercise 3 or 4 times a month is enough to consistently anchor them back in the real world. Like, this isn't all just ones and zeros. This is a real business problem that we're solving to, improve the throughput of a client's business. All right, awesome. So those are my closing thoughts. You have 4 problems here: coordination, motivation, context, and myopia, which just means nearsightedness. If you solve these now, as opposed to solving them as the problems come up, you're going to save yourself probably hundreds of thousands of dollars over the course of the next year, assuming that you're scaling your agency well and you have the fundamentals in place that I've talked about before. I personally would be several $100,000 ahead, probably millions of dollars ahead, had I solved this, not just with this agency, but way back when I was first starting to hire for 1 second copy of my writing agency. Simply because the difference in incentives and the difference in coordination, I know it sounds simple, sort of when you're looking back, but everything sounds simple in retrospect. When you're looking forward and forced to solve these problems yourself, it can be pretty intimidating. But identifying the problem is 90% of actually solving it, so I hope that I've helped you do that in this video. If you guys have any questions about these 4 issues, please just drop a comment down below. I'm more than happy to help. Otherwise, please like, subscribe, do all that fun YouTube stuff, and I'll catch you on the next video. And I will be back to my normal setup as well, for those of you that were wondering. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.